The first bishop of Rome, whom we can call in truth a pope, that is the one who begins to assert authority and power and rule the city and also, in effect, become the ruler and the spiritual leader at the same time, the one who is leading the spiritual community of the Christians and who has inherited the role of the emperors of Rome as ruler of the state, which he did by default. There was nobody else. This man was Gregory I, Pope Gregory I. And Gregory I was the first person we can actually say was a real pope, and I think he is the one who should be recognized as the one who established the papacy in truth. He became Bishop of Rome in 590 and ruled till 604. Now, a remarkable figure for many reasons. First of all, while he was still a monk and before he was Bishop of Rome, he was sent as a representative to the emperor in Constantinople, asking for help. And he came there, and he had an audience with the emperor, and he spoke to him, and he spoke to other people there, and he saw what was going on, and he realized the emperor of Rome could never help Italy. He had too many problems on his hands. He had a lot of things that he couldn't handle and take care of. He certainly didn't have enough to be able to send an army to defend them or to organize anything or to establish anything in the West. So Gregory came back, and he said, in effect, look, we have to do it all on our own. And he had a personality which everyone seemed to feel was powerful. And so when the Bishop of Rome died, they elected him Bishop of Rome. He began to take things into his hands and to organize. And what's interesting is that he always pays his respects to the emperor of Rome as officially the emperor, but he knows he has to handle things by himself. And so he begins to organize, and with his spiritual power, he begins to govern the city, and then in effect to govern the whole area, and becomes the ruler of the whole region, eventually becoming effective also in northern Italy and then in France. And then he must have had a very powerful personality because he convinced the king of Spain to convert to Roman Catholic theology. Italy, France, and Spain, and the Rhineland were now Roman Catholic, and under the rule and control of the Bishop of Rome, Gregory the Great, who was now, I call him the first real pope because he says in his letters and in his decrees that he is carrying on the role of the emperors of Rome, namely as ruler of the state, and he's also carrying on the teachings of St. Peter and St. Paul and Augustine and the spiritual leader, and he's combining the both. Now, as ruler, he had many problems, of course, and he had to deal with them. What's amazing about him and what his genius consists of is in his understanding or his approach to problems. There are different ways of handling problems. One is to ad hoc, you have a problem, solve it, forget about it. He never did that. Considered a problem and thought, what will be the effect of this on the future? He wrote 850 documents that we have in his own hand. And we can see his line of reasoning, you can see his genius. Anything that arose, he tried to think of it in terms of the future. What will this mean for the future? And in effect, he laid out the tracks or the lines for what became the papacy, the real papacy. So we get to the Jewish problem under Gregory. The problem is the following. There were always hostile acts against the Jews. I mean, the Romans attacked the Jews, Greeks attacked the Jews from time to time. There was a big Jewish community in the city of Palermo on the island of Sicily. There are no Jews in Sicily, no Jews in southern Italy, but until the Spaniards conquered it, there were flourishing Jewish communities in southern Italy and Sicily. Reggio, Calabria, Palermo, all of these were big Jewish communities. The city of Palermo had a Jewish community, and some preacher, some Christian preacher began to preach a sermon. He got all excited, and he preached against the Jews, and he preached a violent sermon against the Jews. Violent sermon against the Jews, inspired his congregation. They ran out of the church. They ran to the synagogue and the Jewish community. They threw the Jews out, drove the Jews out. Then they marched over to the home of the bishop, and asked them to come and consecrate this building and turn it into a church. So the bishop comes and they make a big ceremony and converts the synagogue to a church and takes over the buildings of the Jewish community. Well, the Jews of Palermo, they go up to Rome, they go to the synagogue, and they tell the Jews what happened. The Jews of Rome go to Gregory, their bishop, and they tell him what happened. So he writes a letter to his brother, the bishop of Palermo, and tells him, my dear brother Victor, I've heard terrible things. I can't believe what I heard, but is it true that you took Jewish community and synagogue away from them and shouldn't do that? And therefore I suggest that you return everything to the Jews and return their synagogue to them. And just don't see that it doesn't happen again. So Victor writes him a letter and says, my dear brother Gregory, I can't believe what you wrote. You're telling me to desecrate a church by converting it to a synagogue? Huh. So Gregory writes him and says, my dear brother, I can't believe that I suggested a thing like that. I really wouldn't. I mean, it really shouldn't be done. I'll tell you what you have to do. I want you to compensate the Jews and rebuild properties for the Jews, including a new synagogue and all of their institutions. And I want you to do it immediately, and I'm sending down a delegation to see that you start right now. That was his solution of the problem, of the ad hoc problem. But then Gregory sat down and considered, what is the meaning of this in terms of the long range, in terms of the future, in terms of the relationship of the church to the Jews, not just now, but in the future? And he wrote a most remarkable document, an encyclical, also known as a papal bull, that is of the highest papal authority. The name of the bull is Sicut Judaeis non. Whereas the Jewish people do not have a salvation because they have rejected salvation by rejecting Christ and the New Testament. Nevertheless, it is our obligation and duty to protect the Jewish people. Calling upon the teachings of St. Paul and St. Augustine, he made it very clear that Christians must abide by these teachings and that the Jewish people have a significant place in the Christian world, that they are an important element of Christian life, and that the Jewish religion should be respected. And he was the first of the church fathers to actually refer to Judaism as a religion rather than using the pejorative term superstition. This principle, this idea that he expressed in this document, the papal bull Sicut Judaeis non, was followed by later popes and actually was reiterated and republished by other popes down to the 16th century. And this became the principle of the Roman Catholic Church, at least in formality, namely, it is the duty of the Christians and of the Church to protect the Jewish people.